Have you ever felt like you've hit the end of the road? Like no matter how hard you try, how much you pray, how long you wait, nothing changes? You've given your all, but the doors won't open. You've held on, but the weight is too heavy. And now you're standing in the middle of what feels like a dead end, wondering if this is where your story stops. But what if I told you that the moment you feel like giving up is the exact moment God is about to step in? What if the very thing that looks like the end is actually the beginning of something greater? Because God doesn't work on human timelines. He doesn't follow our logic, our expectations, or our deadlines. He moves in ways we can't always see, orchestrating miracles when we least expect them. Some of the greatest breakthroughs happen in the darkest moments. Some of the most powerful testimonies are born from seasons of pain. And the thing that looks like it's over, that's just God setting the stage for something bigger than you imagined. So don't walk away just yet. Your miracle might be closer than you think. When life begins to break apart, when the things you once depended on no longer hold together, it can feel like the end. The pain, the confusion, the overwhelming sense of loss, it all makes you wonder if there's any purpose left in what you're going through. But what if I told you that brokenness is not the conclusion of your story, but the very beginning of something greater? What if the very thing that feels like a setback is actually a setup for transformation? See, we often think that strength is found in holding everything together, but God moves differently. He allows the breaking not to harm you, but to rebuild you in a way you never could have imagined. Brokenness has a way of revealing what truly matters. When everything falls apart, the distractions, the false securities, and the illusions of control get stripped away, leaving you with nothing but the raw reality of who you are. It's in that moment when you feel like you have nothing left that God steps in and shows you that He was always the foundation you needed. Because sometimes we get so caught up in trying to manage our own lives, to create our own paths, that we don't realize we're building on shaky ground. And God in His mercy allows things to break, not to punish us, but to reposition us. Think about a seed. A seed has to be broken before new life can emerge. It has to go into the darkness of the soil, unseen and buried before it ever reaches the light. And if the seed could talk, it might say, why am I being buried? Why is everything closing in around me? But what the seed doesn't realize is that the breaking, the burying is not the end. It's the beginning of something greater. What feels like isolation is actually incubation. What feels like loss is actually transformation. And just like that seed, you may feel like you are in a season where everything is crumbling, where you've been covered up by disappointment, buried by failure, surrounded by darkness, but God is not done. What looks like the end is simply preparation for what's about to bloom. And let's be honest, sometimes it takes the breaking to bring us back to God. We can be so determined to do things on our own, to rely on our own strength, that we don't make space for Him to move. But when life humbles us, when the things we thought would last suddenly crumble, we have no choice but to look up. And that's when God does His greatest work. When we finally surrender, when we stop trying to fix everything ourselves and simply say, God, I can't do this without You. It's in those moments when we feel like we've reached the end of ourselves that we finally make room for the supernatural. Because as long as we believe we have everything under control, we don't give God space to move. But when we're broken, when we're desperate, when we have no choice but to trust Him, that's when we see His power in ways we never imagined. Look at the stories in Scripture. So many of the greatest moments of transformation happened at the lowest points. Joseph was thrown into a pit before he reached the palace. Job lost everything before he received double for his trouble. The woman with the issue of blood had suffered for years before she received her healing. Over and over again, we see the pattern. What looks like the breaking is really the blessing in disguise. And if we take a moment to reflect on our own lives, we can see it too. The things we thought were losses, the moments we thought would destroy us, ended up being the very things that shaped us into who we are. But here's the part we often miss. Brokenness isn't just about what we lose, it's about what we gain. When God allows things to be stripped away, it's because He's making room for something better. He's not just removing, He's refining. He's not just taking away, He's transforming. And while it may not make sense in the moment, while you may not understand why you have to go through the pain, there will come a day when you look back and realize that the breaking was the best thing that ever happened to you. Because without it, you never would have stepped into the fullness of what God had for you. So if you're in that place right now, if you feel like everything is falling apart, if you feel like you've lost too much to ever recover, if you feel like you're at your breaking point, I need you to understand that this is not the end. This is the beginning of something new. You may not see it yet. You may not feel it yet. But God is working. And when the dust settles, when the storm passes, when the process is complete, you will emerge stronger, wiser, and more rooted in your purpose than ever before. Because brokenness is not the end. It's the beginning of the miracle. Faith isn't built in the easy seasons. It's not strengthened when everything is going according to plan, when doors are opening, when prayers are answered right away. Faith grows in the dark places, in the moments when you can't see a way out, when you're waiting on God and wondering if He even hears you. It's easy to believe when life is good, but real faith, the kind that moves mountains, the kind that sustains you through every storm, is forged in the seasons where nothing makes sense. There's something about the dark that exposes what we really believe. When life is bright and full of possibilities, we don't always stop to think about what anchors us. But when the lights go out, when the uncertainty sets in, that's when we come face to face with our deepest fears, our greatest doubts. And for many of us, that moment feels unbearable. The silence of God can feel like rejection. The waiting can feel like punishment. The unanswered prayers can feel like abandonment. But what if the silence isn't a sign that God has left, but an invitation to trust Him on a deeper level? What if the waiting isn't a delay, but a preparation for something greater? Faith isn't just believing when you see the evidence, it's believing when there is none. It's trusting that even in the silence, even in the struggle, God is still working, and that's not easy. It's hard to hold on when everything around you is screaming that it's over. It's hard to keep praying when you don't see any results. It's hard to keep moving forward when every step feels like you're walking deeper into the unknown. But that's where faith is activated. That's where trust is built. Because faith is not about what you feel. It's about what you choose to believe despite your feelings. Look at the stories in Scripture. Over and over, we see people who had to walk through darkness before they ever reached the promise. Abraham was told he would be the father of many nations, yet he had to wait years before the promise was fulfilled. Joseph had dreams of greatness, but before he reached the palace, he was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and wrongfully imprisoned. The Israelites were promised the promised land, but they had to wander in the wilderness first. Even Jesus, before he stepped into his full glory, went through the agony of the cross. There is always a dark season before the breakthrough. There is always a moment when faith has to stand alone before the miracle is revealed. But here's the part we often miss. Just because we can't see God moving doesn't mean He's not working. Just because we don't have the answer yet doesn't mean the answer isn't on the way. The process of faith often requires walking blindly, not because God wants us to struggle, but because He wants us to learn to depend on Him completely. He wants us to trust that even when we can't see the way, He is still leading us. Think about a child learning to walk. At first, they cling tightly to their parent's hand. Every step is uncertain, every movement wobbly. But eventually, the parent lets go. Not because they want the child to fall, but because they know that the only way the child will learn to walk confidently is by learning to balance on their own. The child may stumble, they may fall, they may cry out in frustration, but the parent never leaves. They are right there, watching, waiting, ready to catch them if they need it. And before long, the child realizes something they were never really alone. That's how God works with us. Sometimes it feels like he has let go, like we are stumbling through the darkness without support, but he's still there. He hasn't abandoned us. He's just teaching us to walk by faith and not by sight. And in those moments of struggle, in those moments of doubt, something powerful happens. Our faith grows. We learn that God is not just the God of the mountaintops, but the God of the valleys. We learn that he is not just the God of the open doors, but the God of the waiting rooms. We learn that even when we can't see what he's doing, he is still in control. Some of the strongest people you know, the ones who walk with unshakable faith, the ones who radiate confidence in God, they get there by accident. They got there because they've been through the dark. They've walked through seasons of uncertainty. They've had prayers that went unanswered for years. They've cried out in frustration, wondering where God was, only to look back later and realize he was there all along, working things out behind the scenes. And that's why you can't give up in the dark. That's why you can't let the silence make you doubt his presence, because the dark season is not punishment, it's preparation. It's where faith grows. It's where trust is built. It's where you learn to depend on God in a way you never have before. And when the light finally comes, when the breakthrough finally happens, you will realize that the darkness wasn't working against you, it was working for you. What looks like the end to you is never the end to God. What feels like a closed door, a failed opportunity, or an irreversible loss is never the final chapter when God is the author of your story. He is always ahead of you, already orchestrating things you can't see, making moves that you don't understand, preparing blessings that haven't been revealed yet. The problem is when we're in the middle of our struggles, we often mistake silence for absence. We assume that because we don't see the evidence of his hand, there is no plan at all. But the truth is, God is always working, always moving, always setting things in motion, even when we don't realize it. Life has a way of making us feel like we are running out of time. Like if something doesn't happen now, it will never happen. Like if that relationship didn't work, love will never come again. Like if that job opportunity was lost, success will never be in our future. But God does not operate on our timelines. What looks like a delay to us is just divine timing in motion. What we perceive as a setback is really a setup for something better. And because we can only see what's right in front of us, we get discouraged when things don't go as planned. But if we could see what God sees, if we could glimpse into the future he has prepared, we would stop worrying about what we think we lost and start praising him for what's on the way. Think about the story of Joseph. He had a dream of greatness, a vision of what God had for him. But instead of stepping straight into that promise, he was betrayed, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. From the outside looking in, it seemed like his story was over. It seemed like every door was closing. But what Joseph didn't realize in the moment was that God was already ahead of him. Every situation that looked like a setback was actually pushing him closer to his purpose. Every betrayal, every injustice, every moment of suffering was positioning him for the very thing God had promised. And when the time was right, Joseph didn't just survive, he rose to a position of power that no one could have predicted. That's how God works. He is always 10 steps ahead, already aligning people, opportunities, and divine connections to bring you into your purpose. But because we can't see the full picture, we panic in the middle of the process. We cry over lost opportunities. We grieve over things that didn't work out, and we convince ourselves that it's over. But God is never caught off guard. He is never surprised by what happens in our lives. What may feel like an interruption to you was already factored into his plan. What may seem like a wrong turn was actually rerouting you to something greater. Sometimes God will close a door that we desperately wanted to walk through because he knows what's on the other side. We think that just because we want something, it must be meant for us. But God sees what we can't see. He knows the heartbreak that would have come if you stayed in that relationship. He knows the disappointment that would have followed if you got that job. He knows the weight of carrying something that was never meant for you. So when he takes something away, it's not to hurt you, it's to protect you. And just because it doesn't happen in your timing doesn't mean it's not going to happen. Think about Sarah and Abraham. God gave them a promise of a child, but the years passed with no sign of fulfillment. They grew weary, they doubted, they even tried to make it happen on their own. But when the time was right, when God's timing aligned with the plan he had already set in motion, the promise came to pass. It didn't happen when they expected it, but it happened exactly when it was supposed to. And the same is true for you. So many times we let fear and frustration convince us that we are forgotten. We see time passing. We see others receiving their blessings. And we start to wonder, did God forget about me? But let me tell you, God is not in the business of forgetting his children. If he said it, he will do it. If he promised it, he will fulfill it. And it may not come when you expect it, may not come how you expect it. But when it does, you will understand why the wait was necessary. God is always ahead of you, already aligning everything to work out for your good. What you think is an ending is just a transition. What you see as a closed door is just redirection. He has already written your next chapter. He has already prepared your breakthrough. And when the time is right, when the process is complete, you will step into something that was greater than you ever imagined. Because he was never behind. He was never late. He was always ahead, preparing the way before you even knew you needed it. If you take nothing else from this, hear me when I say this. What looks like the end is never the end when God is involved. The silence isn't his absence. The waiting isn't his rejection. And the closed doors aren't his punishment. They are all a part of a divine process. A process that may not make sense now, but will one day reveal his perfect plan. Faith isn't about seeing, it's about trusting. Trusting that even in the darkest moments, God is still working. Trusting that even when things fall apart, he is building something greater. Trusting that what you thought was the end is actually a setup for something beyond your imagination. So don't give up. Don't lose hope. Don't let the struggle convince you that God has forgotten about you, because right when you think it's over, right when you're ready to walk away, that's when he steps in. That's when his miracle begins. And when he moves, when his plan unfolds, you'll look back and realize every tear, every trial, every setback was just a part of the testimony he was writing for you all along.